Girlfriends, episode number 392, Many Paths to Holiness with Marie Mazzanti. Hello and welcome to Girlfriends. I'm Danielle Bean. I'm a wife and a mom, and I'm on a mission to help you know your worth as a woman so you can find peace, balance, and joy in family living. This week, our special guest is Marie Mazzanti, talking about how there's no one right way to do things as a Catholic woman. Can't wait to have this important conversation. Let's get going. Hey, girlfriend, how are you? Thank you so much for joining me here for the newest episode of the Girlfriends podcast. Always happy to be able to connect with you here. This week, we're diving into this topic that I think is so important because it can be really tempting sometimes to think there's one right way to raise a Catholic family, one right way to become a saint, one right way to be a Catholic wife, mother, woman, human being, And I say tempting because that's very simplistic. It can simplify things. If there's one right way, we can make sure we're doing the one right thing and we're all set. And so that is the temptation to simplify things in that way. And yet God is so much bigger than that. So that's why I was really encouraged to have this conversation with my new Instagram friend, Marie Mazzanti, this week. But, in my conversation with her, that I'm going to share in just a moment, I really was reminded of even going way back in the second book I ever published, which was Mom to Mom, Day to Day, Advice and Support for Catholic Living. And it's so funny thinking about that tagline and how the tagline of Girlfriends is about family living. Not much has changed in these many years. And yet, back when I wrote that book, I remember that there was a chapter in there where I kind of took on the idea of parenting philosophies. And again, that temptation to think there's kind of a magic formula for raising a good Catholic family, for being a good Catholic couple, being a good Catholic wife. What does it look like? Kind of a cookie cutter way of kind of approaching it. And that kind of simplification, as sometimes it might be appealing to us because we can then think we got it, like we're doing it the one right way, right? And yet that's not really how God works. And I remember I talked about that in that book and kind of a little bit tongue in cheek, talked about parenting philosophies. And I shared that my parenting philosophy was do what works best for your family. And you know what? I was astonished that was met with some controversy. It ended up, some people really rejected that idea of quote unquote philosophy of doing what works best for your family. And I found that amazing, but also very educational about kind of humanity and some of the temptations we face in the world today and even in the church, that it's tempting sometimes to think there is one right way. It's tempting to think there's an overall parenting philosophy or approach or an approach to marriage that's going to be kind of one size fits all for how to be holy. And yet the church doesn't teach us those kinds of specifics. The important things, yes, the church does outline for us about marriage and family and, about human life and the ways that we're meant to be calling out this vocation to marriage and raising our children. And yet the things that the church doesn't say, I think are equally important. It's important to recognize that there are lots of different ways of answering that call to holiness and to not limit God in that way. Anyway, so that's why I was really encouraged by my conversation with Marie. We went even longer than I anticipated going just because she had so much to share. And I'm hoping to have her back on and possibly invite her for a future live event over at Good Catholic because she's just got a lot of experience and, knowledge to share on various topics related to this idea of our identity as Catholics, our identity as Catholic women, and the ways that sometimes is colored by our culture, even by culture inside the church sometimes that gets it a little bit wrong or is tempted to kind of put limitations on who we are and who God called us to be. And I think ultimately it is so important for us to remember that God made each of us unique and that we have a unique calling in his eyes. And that if we're focused there, whether or not it matches up with the person down the block or your sister or that saint you read about in a book, doesn't matter. If you're focused on your relationship with God and your own unique call to holiness, that's what's key. And I love how Marie really brings this out. So I know you're going to enjoy this conversation. Take a listen. Joining me here today on Girlfriends is Marie Mazzanti. Marie is a devout Catholic in a mixed faith marriage, raising 5 little saints to live out the true teachings of Christ and his church. Marie runs the Instagram page Catholic Caritas, where she shares her passion for the Catholic faith and provides encouragement and support for those that find themselves in interfaith marriages. She has a passion for the pro-life movement and has taught pregnancy, birth, and parenting classes at crisis pregnancy centers, and is currently working with the St. John Paul II Life Center to get supplies to mothers in need. Marie Mazzanti, welcome to Girlfriends. I'm so happy you're here.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
Yeah. So, I actually recently heard your interview on the Gotta Be Saints podcast, specifically talking about interfaith marriage. And you and I kind of talked a little bit back and forth on Instagram about interfaith marriage. Maybe just to begin this conversation, you can describe, what your marriage is like, and how you came to be involved in an interfaith marriage. What was that road like for you?
Yeah. So that's a great podcast. Definitely listen to if you want me to go really deeply into it. But ultimately, raised devout Catholic, cradle Catholic, and always thought I was going to marry a Catholic, have this perfect Catholic marriage and this perfect Catholic family. And I'm sure many people can relate. And, just the young, idealistic viewpoint of life. And so the guy that I was dating at that time was very Catholic, had like 10 brothers and sisters, and kind of ends up where we ended up breaking up the first or second year of my first year of college. And it was devastated, and I didn't understand. And this is kind of like the beauty of what I think that we were about to talk about is, I didn't understand God's plan, because I'm not God. Yeah. And it was very confusing to me. And then God presents me with my now husband, a Protestant, but a Christ-centered man with just virtue coming out of his ears. And so I was, deeply confused by this, but, I pursued it with caution. But as we started, pursuing it and understanding we both wanted marriage and all the things, the discernment process, we really, honestly, by the grace of God and the Holy Spirit, I didn't have much help in the area, which is kind of why this drew me to this kind of calling in the social media space. But, a lot of my own research and like, what do we need to talk about? Well, I don't want you going into this blindly and going, yeah, I love you, so whatever. And then we actually have kids and you go, I didn't know that meant believing in the true presence of Christ in the Eucharist. Yeah. You have to say yes to all of these things. And it was, arduous, but the process was, I think honestly what all engaged couples, regardless of if they're both Catholic or not, should go through to discuss all the things, because then once you become engaged, it's a little easier to not feel so much pressure. And we had already discussed everything. And then it turns out that the guy that I was dating previously was called to be a priest.
Oh, so that's why that worked out that way.
Yeah. So kind of like our calls to holiness is so specific and unique. And even though we both at the time thought we're going to get married and have this really Catholic family, and in our minds, we couldn't even have pictured what was going to happen. He became a priest. I ended up marrying a Protestant. We now have 4 beautiful boys with a baby girl on the way as our 5th. And we're raising devout Catholic little saints. And, it's not without trial and error, and not without, heavy discussions, I think, with every marriage, even if it's 2 Catholics. And so, that I think that whole process has in turn, because we were both focused on the same thing, which is Christ, that it's just made us both holier. And so I think that I'm very adamant in my belief that God's call to us to be holy is just so different for every single person. And for us to believe that there is only one way is actually the opposite of the Gospels.
Right. Yeah. Oh, I love that. Because I think that could maybe be a theme for our conversation here today. There is no one right way, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And I love that you share your story that, this wasn't what you envisioned, and that you had a hard time kind of wrapping your brain around it, because I think many of us can relate to that, whether it's about who you marry or whether you marry or all of these things, that sometimes we have this very narrow vision of the one right way, or maybe it's the way you were raised, or, and there are ways we idealize things for good reason, and they can be beautiful things. But like your story tells us, there are different paths, and God might call you in a different way. And now I hear from people all the time who are in interfaith marriages. I know you do, because this is a conversation you frequently take on Instagram, and they're struggling, so I think that it's important to be realistic about what we're talking about here, because your marriage sounds so beautiful. And it's
and it is very ideal too. I talk about that too, where, the thing is, I've learned so much, but it is still the ideal of the non-ideal, if you want to say it that way, that I'm blessed to have a husband that was more non-practicing Protestant, but I, but I have a lot of experience with I have converts throughout my whole life. My aunt and my uncle, who I'm very close with, who are my godparents, were interfaith for 20 something. Yeah, probably more years than that, but he converted at the age of 55.
Right.
And my mom was Baptist before I was born. She converted. And then pretty much all my aunts have converted to Catholicism. So like there's like, and my two best friends are converts. So lots of converts in my life in all varying situations. So, I've just had a lot of experience in that area. And sometimes, with people, especially when they speak down to me choosing interfaith marriage, the help isn't just there for people who choose it. It's there for, maybe it's a someone that was Protestant in a marriage with another Protestant and they converted. They're in an interfaith marriage now, and they chose their spouse before they came home. And that's something I think a lot of people forget too.
All right. So maybe you can explain to us just a little bit in a practical level, how does this work? Right? Because this is what I hear from people all the time. They're like, okay, I'm in this interfaith marriage, and they're all varying degrees, right? Sometimes the husband is antagonistic toward the faith, but even other times they're just sort of removed from it, not involved. But what does it look like in your marriage, in your family?
So specifically in my marriage, again, I was really blessed with a husband who I was not only just highly compatible with, where we just were meshed on so many levels, that he appreciated my assertiveness and, the way I am an Italian, of heritage. And so I tend towards the more assertive nature, that he appreciated that I knew what I wanted and I knew why I wanted it. And so even if he didn't, it took us a couple of years to go over, it wasn't like, a weekend thing. We dated for 5 years before we got married. We were in college. So there was a little bit of a wiggle room there. It wasn't so much pressure, but it was a lot of heavy discussions about, there was even some things that I wasn't totally sure on where it was in the Catholic Church or the Catholic faith, or why, what it came from. But I knew that I believed it. And so it actually helped me dive a little bit deeper into my faith to be able to explain, for example, NFP, coming from a Protestant background, many Protestants, they've never even heard of it. And so to be able to sit down with my husband and not only say, I will not accept this in my marriage, whether it be porn, whether it be contraception, and for me to have a reason why, not just to be like, because I really don't like it, or the church just says. I'm like, no, the church says. But what does the church say? And so I was able to bring up beautiful works that are just such gifts to us for resources like Humanae Vitae by Pope Paul VI, the encyclical. And I was able to bring up Theology of the Body by Pope John Paul II, and kind of bring up all these teachings that not only are beautiful religious works, but they're intellectual. They make sense from a science base too, for using NFP, the divorce rate is really low. And with Theology of the Body, it made more sense towards understanding, your femininity and masculinity, and understanding, so I was able to, again, my husband is very intellectual, and he was able to understand like, well, all of these things, and this is probably the most important thing I would say for interfaith couples is that it leads towards good. I always ask, do you believe this is going to lead towards damnation and taking us further away from God? Or do you think this would lead us towards good? Because when they really had to think about it, someone isn't going to say, well, I think contraception will lead me towards God. It's really hard to back that up. Even if you don't, you want to accept contraception, it's really hard to back that up. So it's definitely a lot deeper than just having a shallow conversation. But I would say that mostly it's communication and then openness to the fact that you love this person. And so since you love this person, there's aspects of that person that you love that you may not think that you love. Like maybe they aren't Catholic, but part of my husband's pull that I fell in love with was a lot of it came from his Protestant background, And so I think that for me to better understand that doesn't mean I have to love the Protestant faith. It just means that I understand that what made my husband the person that I love, and his view to what makes me the person who my husband loves, is my faith. And so I have to appreciate that on some level. And then you can kind of go through the intricacies of apologetics if you want.
Right. Yeah. Okay. And I love that you share that, and that it kind of strengthens your own faith to be entering into this relationship. I can see how it's working for you in your specific circumstances. Do you have any words of advice or encouragement you might offer to somebody who's like, well, that sounds pretty great. Like, that's not my situation, right? There are people who are maybe struggling, maybe not on the same page spiritually at all. Like you said, maybe had a conversion or a reversion after the fact. These kinds of things happen all the time, and it's difficult to not be on the same page.
Yeah. And just like you said, there is sometimes, and I've gotten a lot of messages from people where that's an antagonistic type of relationship. And that's really where I kind of say that it comes down to like Christian to Christian, right? So you can drop all of the armor and the apologetics, although it's amazing to have these things. And really speak to the heart of if you are being antagonistic towards your partner and your partner is being antagonistic towards you, like none of that is coming from Christ, right? So we can all agree from a Christian level that antagonizing each other in any way isn't going to be good. And, so I always say, like, reach to the heart first, like understand why your spouse is the faith that they are, whatever it may be, and this is coming from a person who I have friends who are Catholics married to Muslims. And so that is from a perspective of that they are raising their kids Catholic and they are making it work so far, again, I don't know the future, but so far because they understand that they love each other first. And then they can kind of figure out the deeply important, but intricacies where you have to reach the person's heart, because I don't know about anyone, watching or listening to this for you, but I don't think anyone's heart or mind has ever been changed because they were just beaten to death by the truth. That is pretty rare if it does happen. And so I would say first that, and second, just especially if you're the Catholic spouse, like look to the saints. I mean, Saint Monica is huge in my life when it came to, and it's always funny because she's a patron saint of difficult husbands and children. And I never thought of my husband as being difficult, but I get it. She had a husband that was not, even Christian. And so he, there was a Saint Blessed Elizabeth. I always forget, it's something French. I can't remember. I can never pronounce the part of it that she has. She's blessed. And her story is even better than Saint Monica's because her husband was antagonizing. He did antagonize her to the point. Yes. And she struggled with it. She wrote a diary, and actually believe you can look up the diary. And so I will hopefully get that name right.
Yeah. We'll definitely need to get that follow up with that information.
And so eventually she died, and her husband found her diary and read about what she went through for him, and that, she still loved him and the suffering she had. She also had some illnesses too. And he was so, struck by her diary that he still then decided to go to, I think, France, and to prove that Catholicism was wrong, because he was like, well, all this. And then I think it was a Franciscan monk that converted him. So he converted even after her death. Yeah. So, and that I think is just, it's helpful to understand that this isn't a new thing, that this isn't something, and now it's becoming a lot more popular. But I think that it is definitely something we need to understand, that we can lean on a lot of the saints to understand that you can still be you can be a saint. Right. You can still be a saint and be in an interfaith marriage or a mixed faith marriage or whatever state of life that you're in, it sometimes is a stepping stone to your sainthood, as opposed to a blockade, which I feel like sometimes, our church, the people can kind of make people feel like when they're not in a perfect marriage state of life, that they're all of a sudden blocked from sainthood. And I think that's a tragedy.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. And I love that you refer to your children as you're raising saints, right? Because that's the goal for everybody, right? It's not an arrogant thing to say, right? That's supposed to be all of our goals, raising saints, becoming saints ourselves. And there are all different ways that we do it. Now, you touched upon this idea of authentic masculinity and femininity, some of St. John Paul II's teachings on theology, the body, such beautiful depth there for people who want to go further. But could we talk about that a little bit? Like, what is like a Catholic understanding in your mind of the different roles that we play in marriage, and how does that play out specifically in your own marriage, especially with a husband who doesn't share your Catholic faith?
Yeah. So kind of what you're touching on here is you could, we look at Ephesians, right? This is everyone's favorite.
Ephesians 5. We love it when that's read.
They love it. Yeah. And it's used incorrectly a lot. And then it's used beautifully in some instances. And I think that when the thing I get asked the most is, how can your husband be the spiritual head of your household if you are the Catholic? And you relate to that. I have to say that I think there's two answers to it. The first one is that I think there is a great misunderstanding of Ephesians. I think that when I am explained to it by a lot of people, I don't think they're wrong. I think they don't know how to explain it well. In most cases, that it essentially, they always stop after that, where it says the husband is the head of the house, and they stop when in reality, I mean, really, you need to read all of Ephesians,
Right.
But when you really go further and you look into it, I mean, the man's role is even, it feels even greater than what they talked about the husband being, the wife being submissive. So when you look at it, the husband is really called to be submissive too, in a different way, right? You are submitting to each other. And the idea is that you submit to your husband because it's like submitting to Christ, right? Because you would submit to Christ because he sees you, loves you, understands you, is gentle with you. It is not a domineering submissive,ness where people think, and sadly,
that's what people hear. Yeah.
Right. That's our culture, though. When you think of submissiveness, you think of oppressive, and it's not oppressive. That's the problem, is they're connecting oppressiveness with submissiveness, and submissiveness is willingly submitting because you want to. And so if you're in a situation where you don't want to submit because of you're having a feeling of oppressiveness, then really it's the husband's job as a leader. Though, when we look at what Christ says about being a leader, you're also a servant. That's one of the things that he says in Matthew. And he speaks to, the apostles saying that if you want to lead, you must first serve. And we see Christ washing the apostles' feet. And that's what Ephesians is. That's the part that they miss when they talk about the husband, is that your husband isn't, if he is actually physically washing your feet, that's awesome. But if he's, theoretically washing your feet, then you want to submit to a man like that. And so you have to bring in, but you cannot talk about one without the other. And so with my husband's situation, my husband is the head of our household, but if he calls me to sin, I'm not obligated to submit. Right. So let's say my husband, and this is, something that I'm sure happens in a lot, and I've been, DM'd before about it, where their husband or the wife or the non-Catholic, typically can be the husband, where they want to use contraception, and so the wife's like, but, he's the head of the household. I'm like, yeah, but you're not obligated to follow something that is sinful. So therefore you are then, in your Ephesians role, able to come to your husband and explain why this is not okay. And it's not of submitting blindly, it's submitting to the Gospels. And that's you're submitting to your husband. Christ is first. Right. So if he's not going in for Christ, and we say this to our kids too, when it comes to, we talk about the commandments. So it goes all in line, down this line, where your husband is submitting to Christ, you are submitting to your husband, and your children are submitting to both of you. But if none of those people are submitting to Christ, then it's the line is broken.
It's null and void. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Everyone is submitting to Christ. And so it's definitely this idea that I think when people think about the submission, that it's this one domineering thing that a husband speaks about. And I think that that's a travesty, because when we really look at the mutual submissiveness, it's a conversation, just like I spoke about before. There is no, we're moving and that's it. And then the family and the wife just has to be quiet about it. That's not submissiveness, right? Like, the submissiveness doesn't mean your husband is a dominant, totalitarian, dictator. It's still a family, so we have to make sure we're not being too rigid in our understanding of the Gospels in this way. We have to be able to understand it's still a relationship. We still have to look at theology of the body, where we are made for each other. If we're made for each other, then one of us isn't over the other one. It's sort of like this really beautiful, ball that's twisting around, that's the only way I can describe it.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. What I'm hearing in what you're saying really resonates with me, because what I'm hearing you saying is that what's lacking in some of these, even in the church, right? Some of these misunderstandings of these roles is, first of all, love. Like, if that's not there, then none of it applies, right? But then understanding it in terms of relationship, that's what's missing so many times if you hear that reading at Mass and it hits wrong, you're pulling it out of the context of a relationship. For sure. That's something I experienced, early on when I was a young single. My dad was a philosophy professor. I remember going to him with this passage and saying, what on earth? This makes no sense to me, Dad. Come on. And he really tried to explain it to me. And, I tried my best to wrap my brain around it, but I was a 16-year-old girl and trying to figure out what God was calling me to. But then when I revisited that, when I was engaged and, knew I was meant to marry my husband, Dan, it was putting Dan's name in that context, no brainer. It's because I trust him and I know he loves me and he wants what's best for us and for our future family. And all of it just made sense. So I think that's probably a big part of how people get this wrong. Yeah. But then that first part, love, there are people, and I'm sure people like this in life and online, where the love is missing from that conversation about this relationship between a husband and wife. and then everything just hits wrong after that.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
it doesn't make sense. The love is missing. And the people that I know in real life and otherwise, they're like obsessed with that kind of passage and applying it to their lives and everybody else's lives in very particular ways.
Yeah.
Like that's universally what's missing in the
and
equation.
I think that especially young women now, they're looking to have, they want a solid understanding. And, we can kind of shift in even now into the roles of, like, we could talk about biblical gender roles, that the idea of gender roles from the way we understand it, they're not biblical. That's not in the Bible. And the reason we know this is because we can look at the church and we can look at how she doesn't have, there's a lot of works in the church, a lot of very specific, there's a whole encyclical about contraception. There's a whole encyclical about the value of human life and very specificness. A lot of churches don't have that. And so for us to look at it and see that there's no encyclical specifically about women should work or not work, women should, and there's so much discernment for, even when we look at the teachings on, contraceptions, that there's still a lot of room for discernment of the couple. There's God trusts us, if it really was only one way, then the church would have it written down somewhere, they're very good about that. And so for us to look at femininity and masculinity, I can kind of start with my own experience with it when I was younger, where I didn't like dolls. I loved competition and sports. I was a bit of like a misfit in that it wasn't that I was a total tomboy, but a lot of the things that girls liked, I didn't like. And I was, and I came from a very Southern mother, Southern Belle mother who loved dolls and just was, like, oh, why aren't you wearing makeup today? Sort of thing. And so coming from that perspective, I was very confused about my femininity at the beginning, where, and nowadays, luckily I grew up in the generation that I did, being a millennial, that wasn't challenged quite as much. And so because of that, I started to really look into like, okay, like what, at first it was only Mary, and our Blessed Mother is definitely a perfect example of the way to live out your call, which is that her fiat, like everyone has their own fiat. What is your yes? And your yes may not be the same as another person's yes. Like, the reason she's a great example is because we're not all called to bear the Son of God. So, and so but her yes, that's what we need to focus on. And I used to think it meant I needed to be, exactly like Mary, her personality, everything. And I was like, wow, I'm loud, I'm opinionated. What does that mean? Does that mean that I need to like completely mold myself into exactly who Mary was? Or do I need to make sure that I'm not trying to in fact, what the devil wants is for us to look at another woman and say, I have to be exactly like her in order to be holy. And because you will never meet that, because that's practically impossible, because God made us individually and because he made us so specifically and uniquely, and our path to him is so specific and unique, that for us to try and copy another path is a path to failure. It will always be a path to failure. And when that happens, that's when we fall, when we go, well, I'm not holy enough, so sin it is, And so whenever that happens, I think that I started to look to the saints and what a blessing they are in our church, because we have Saint Joan of Arc, who exhibited, she was a peasant girl who never married, who exhibited her femininity through leading the French army into a momentous victory. And she wore pants doing it, and then you have St. Catherine of Siena, who was a nun that was, considered, a doctor of the church and had a fiery nature to her, and basically brought the papacy back to Rome, by confronting Pope Gregory VI and just like telling him what to do. And he was like, yeah, okay, I'll listen to you. So we have these, and then we have Mother Teresa, who was, just a beloved, person in general, and a saint, and her just meekness and humility. And then you have, even Saint Zélie Martin, who was a stay-at-home mother who gave us another saint and five nuns. And then also her husband is a saint. So you have all these varying degrees of women becoming saints in such different circumstances, where you can't look at a woman nowadays and say, you will only be a saint if you wear a dress to mass every day. You will only be a saint if you are a stay-at-home mom and you have 20 kids. We can't say that, because when we look at the saints, that's not what happens, that may be your call. Your call may be to stay home and have 20 kids. And if that's your call and and you're saying yes to it, bless you. And that's what your call is. But to look at another woman and to say she's not listening to God because her life doesn't look the same as yours, well, then you're not really understanding, one, the saints, and two, the gospel. And so there's so much more examples of those saints. So, definitely look up those saints if you've never heard of them and read about their lives. They're amazing. And they will just make you understand, like, wow, I just need to go in front of Christ and say, what is it? Like, what is my path? Because it's not, you won't copy them. We're not all going to read the French army. We're not all going to raise 5 nuns, but there's a different call. And that's so comforting. And it is when you really start to understand, and you hear about it a lot in the Protestant community, but I think we really need to kind of encapsulate that as Catholics, is the personal relationship with Jesus is really more the personal. It's the theology of the body, that you were made and no one will ever exist like you, or has existed like you, or will exist like you. And it's like, that's the part where we need to hear that from a, intellectual perspective, from people nowadays, when we talk about femininity, saying, especially with a majority of little girls thinking that they want to become a boy because they are despising their femininity in a way because they believe it has to be a certain thing. And that's the travesty of what has happened in our culture. And we can even look to, so Edith Stein is another one of my favorite saints. She is St. Teresa of Benedicta of the Cross, but Edith Stein is, if you want to look up her books, it's Edith Stein. And in her essays on women, she actually kind of addresses this, where she says, but this surrender becomes a perverted self-abandon and a form of slavery when it is given to another person and not to God. At the same time, it is an unjustified demand which no human being can fulfill, which is that we have this box of femininity and this box of masculinity. And when you try and put it that way, that she was saying, if you can't fulfill it, you're not looking to God. You're looking to I guess you would say, like a secular understanding of the gospel, of femininity, of the way you're made. And so we're not abandoning ourselves to God when we say, we're thinking that the way to combat the new ideology of gender, of sexuality, is to go the opposite direction where it was before. That's wrong. We're actually perpetuating it by making people feel like there is one way to be something. And if you're not that, then you must be the other thing, because that's how logically it would work. And, when we talked about Theology of the Body by Pope John Paul II, this is a man who was Pope. And he was just an incredible force in the church. If you look at what he survived. So manliest of men, loved skiing, loved the mountains, survived the Nazis in Poland. But he loves poetry and he loves theater and he loves the youth and babies. And it's like, when you look at this man and he wrote Theology of the Body, you got to know that he knew what he was talking about. And his love for women and his understanding of women made me feel naked reading. It's just about his I think his letter to women. That was one of the things where I was like, how could you, and even Theology of the Body and all of it, how could you, a man who's never been married, who, could know me so, my femininity so deeply and well. And it was why you go, okay, this has to be the Holy Spirit.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. I had the same reaction to his readings. I mean, to his writings. It's just so beautifully said. And like you say, and I remember this one quote from Edith Stein where she says that to be feminine is to be expansive, which I love, because like what you're describing, this like trying to put people into a box is the opposite of expansive, right? It's very restrictive, right? Yeah. And yet fully embracing your femininity looks like, well, allow God to decide what that looks like in your life. And you mentioned some of the kind of modern takes on these gender ideologies and how dangerous that is. Yeah. And I've just been really, saddened, of course, but also interested to see where our culture is going with this, right?
And why did it happen?
Yes.
People
why are we there?
Their opinions on it, but if you really look at why it happened, I think that is probably where you can figure out what the answer is. Jason Everett is great on this. If you don't know who he is, look him up. He has amazing teachings on chastity, and I just love him. He has a great thing with Pints Aquinas. But you said the thing about the box, it reminded me of it, because he has a quote, I think it was in a podcast, I don't remember, but I loved it. And it's burned in my brain, where he said, femininity isn't a box we place women in. It's something you step on to blossom into the person who God wants you to be. And I was just beautiful. Yes. Like exactly what you said. Edith Stein said, like, it's an expansive thing. It's not one thing. Now there are objective truths to it, right? Like, in Pope John Paul's discussions of masculinity and femininity, basically what he says, he uses these terms exclusively in reference to males and females respectively, meaning like being masculine is simply a way of being a man in the world, and a way being feminine is a way of being a woman in the world. So when my husband is caring for our kids, like has a baby strapped to him, is cooking dinner, listening to Adele or Taylor Swift, that's all masculine. That's all masculine because he's a male, because he was born male, and so whenever it's in the same way, if I'm ever running a meeting, and exhibiting my assertiveness during a staff meeting or caring for my newborns, those things are both feminine because I am female.
Right.
And we can explain it that way because, you hear this all the time. What is a woman? And some people are having a really hard time, even Catholics, even Christians, to say, well, it's this. And then somebody, well, what about this? What about a woman that's barren? What about a woman that's infertile? And for us to be able to look at them and say, it's about fecundity and it's in the sex body, or gender is based in the sex body. That's the Catholic, at the beginning of this, you were saying, like, what is the Catholic perspective of this? And so in the midst of linguistic and conceptual disarray, when it comes to those words, we must make an incarnational move where we look at like the sexed body first, and then know that even if you were ordered towards it, your fecundity means that you were born female and you were ordered, even if you were, something happened and genetically speaking, something was disordered, that doesn't mean that you weren't ordered towards it to begin with. And so infertile women are still women and they're still feminine. Right. And in the same way that a nun that doesn't have children can still be maternal. And that's where you can look to the feminine genius teachings on, women. Some women will say, I'm not maternal, I don't want kids, or whatever. Or you can even say someone could say, well, a nun isn't maternal because she doesn't have kids. But we see these instincts come out through society all the time. And instead of pushing them away, especially in the business sphere, and saying, oh, in order to work in the business world, I must be masculine acting, meaning I push away these natural instincts of women. That in reality, what the feminine genius talks about is the embracing these, and the world needs them. We need women CEOs that are exhibiting generosity and maternal instincts and reciprocity. Like, we need that because those are good leaders. I mean, I still, to this day, I joke with my mom all the time that, talking about the patriarchy and all those things, that I'm like, I wouldn't believe in, the basis of that unless it was the fact that I know that when I see women working, when I see women in running their families or anything like that, I don't know how we haven't had a woman president, because she would just totally take over this world in a good way, and of course it has to be a good woman, same as a good man, but just our qualities really are needed in the world. They're needed, men and women. Men aren't going to be erased either. It's that men need to understand where their qualities are good and holy and where they're bad, because there is toxic leadership in general for men and women. And when you see a good leader, it's because they have these qualities of to some extent of a servant, of guidance, of education. And so when women can bring that into the workforce, and for someone to say that that is not a good thing, then they don't really understand the Gospels well. And I think that's probably the hardest part about explaining this idea of femininity in this world, where people have told me that I can't wear pants. I shouldn't wear pants to mass, or that because I'm assertive and I'm very, dominant in my relationship, just meaning that I speak up a lot, and my husband still puts me in my place, and I put him in his mind that means that for some reason I'm not living out my feminine role in my marriage. And it just blows my mind when I hear it, because I'm like, you're perpetuating the problems that we are having. You're going the opposite direction. And I think that's sad for our children. That's why this topic that we're talking about is so important, because as I'm having actually my first daughter, I'm
I didn't realize it's your first. Oh, that's
it
great.
is. Yeah. After 4 boys. Yeah. And so after having my first daughter, all of these, things are coming up for me. Realizing that in a way, it's not very much different at the first few years of raising them, where I'm still teaching them all the same things, but to be able to understand not only from the perspective of femininity and masculinity with my boys and my girl, is also like modesty, all these things that women hear about that are really confusing for a modern Catholic woman. And that doesn't mean modern Catholic women, meaning you are getting away from traditional teachings. It's meaning I live in 2023 and I am a Catholic woman with a very old ancient faith. And so how do I apply that here? And I think that's probably the hard part.
Absolutely. Actually making that relevant in the world today. And these are timeless truths. I mean, getting back to where we were at the beginning, like the church has teachings about very specifically about the things we need teachings about very specifically. But then I think that the kind of inherent teaching in the fact that these things aren't spelled out. Like, how do you pay your bills? It's not spelled out, right?
Yeah.
Like, but for some people it is, right? Or they would say that it is. And I find that between that and also kind of the modern mistaken, elements of our culture with regard to gender identity, it's all this temptation to reduce male and female to kind of the trappings of it, right?
Yeah.
What it looks like from the outside.
Yeah.
And I find that so dehumanizing and so limiting in a way that doesn't fully give God the space in which to work, which we know the amazing things he can do. You describe some of the lives of the saints, like, who would have thought those things up, right? Like nobody, right? Nobody, especially those people themselves.
Exactly.
And so we need to be inviting God into that and to be open to what he's calling us to do. And it might look very different from the person who lives down the street, the person who sits next to you in the pew, your sister, your mom, but being tuned into your relationship with the Lord and knowing how he's uniquely calling you to use your feminine gifts in the world and in your own home and family, in the world at large. He's got a plan for that. Yeah. And I think that's the beautiful and encouraging thing that I take away from everything that you're sharing, which is so beautiful and, just so encouraging to hear somebody speak so articulately about it, that, we all do have that calling and to just focus on that. If you're confused about it, if you're feeling like, can I do this? Can I do that? Bring it to God and be focused in your relationship with him and allow him to direct what decisions you're going to make with regard to whether or not you work, whether or not you marry, whether or not you're wearing pants, right? Like all of these things.
Follow a Catholic influencer on Instagram or a blog. Follow God, and if those people are directing you back to the Gospels, but if they're telling you what the Gospels say, and I don't remember who said this, but it's like, go check yourself. Like, go check for yourself. Don't just listen to this person and go, oh, they brought up this people do it all the time. They brought up a random quote by St. Padre Pio, and you just take that one quote and you go, oh, I should wear pants from that. Yeah. And it's dangerous across the board. And so for us to also look at, it's so beautiful for us to be able to have this faith because there are checks and balances, right? You can't just look to the saints. You have to also look to the gospel and you have to look to the church. So it's this beautiful web of like, I check myself through the saints, but I also have to look at it and go, okay, the saints weren't infallible. Now they're saints, but it doesn't mean they were infallible. I mean, look at St. Thomas Aquinas and his, misunderstanding of the Immaculate Conception, so you kind of have to understand that they were born in a certain time. It's very intellectual. And that's what I love about our faith. It doesn't mean you have to be the most insanely smart person to understand it, but there's so much depth and richness to it that if you feel iffy about any teaching, you can dive deep into it and get a solid answer based on prayer, based on the catechism, based on the gospels. And you can actually get a solid understanding rather than just waiting for, even when I say, even on my Instagram, if it sounds weird, go check it and correct me, and understand that like there's a whole point to us having all of these resources. God didn't drop us on earth and drop us a Bible and go, good luck, like he gave us the church. And it's so amazing. And I'm so grateful for it because it probably would be I would be very lost without it. And I find a lot of women that aren't Catholic do feel lost because they don't have, as much as people like to harp on the church about it, it's when they don't understand it. They don't have these women roles to look to, our Blessed Mother, these saints, like it is something that motherhood is uplifted and womanhood is uplifted, not just motherhood, but womanhood. And so, they don't have religious orders. And so it really is this thing where we as Catholic women really do need to help shine that light on even our Protestant brothers and sisters in Christ to show them the beauty of it through the church, because everyone's confused. Right.
Yeah. That's a beautiful gift that we have. Well, we're almost out of time here, Marie. I've really enjoyed this conversation. Can you let me know and others, where can we find you online? Where can people follow you and learn more about what you're doing?
Yeah. So I have my Instagram, which is Catholic Caritas, Caritas. And then I do have a YouTube channel, which is it's kind of fallen behind a little bit ever since we got pregnant. So I plan on having a lot more content and on the back burner right now, a lot more interfaith content of just really showing everyone how to have conversations. I think that's the thing that I've waited a little bit to figure out, doing a lot of polls, trying to figure out what is it that people needed. And basically the new stuff I'm going to be putting out hopefully soon, but I can't promise anything, is just a lot more conversational guides as to how to open your heart to another person and to be able to better understand each other but also stay firm in your faith.
Wonderful. All right. We'll have all of that linked up in the show notes over at goodcatholic.com. Marie Mazzanti, thank you so much for joining me here on Girlfriends today. It's been a real pleasure talking with you.
You too. Thank you so much.
All right. We've got more of the show coming up for you, but first we're going to take a quick break. I'm Danielle Bean, and you're listening to the Girlfriends Podcast.
All who have died in God's grace and friendship, but still imperfectly purified, are indeed assured of their salvation. But after death, they undergo a purification so as to achieve the holiness necessary to actually be able to enter into the joy of heaven. We want to look at the reality of purgatory in a very clear and objective fashion, as opposed to sort of the popular notions, or even the popular piety that has surrounded the actual doctrine of purgatory. Remember that no one lives alone, no one sins alone, and no one is saved alone. You and I are engaged together in the work of sanctification, my soul, your soul, and the souls of the faithful departed. Let's not forget them, but accompany them, as St. Ambrose said, all the way to the mountain of the glory of God.
All right, now we're at the point in the show where I like to share some listener feedback. And since that interview went a little long, I'm not going to share a big, long question and answer here in this section, but I want to share a recent review that I got over on iTunes. You know, sometimes in this section, I'll ask you to review the podcast because that truly is a helpful way that you can let me know what you're enjoying about Girlfriends. Let me know maybe the kinds of things you'd like to see. Of course, you can always email me, Danielle@daniellebean.com, but leaving a rating and review in a place like iTunes or Spotify or wherever you listen to podcasts is truly helpful to the podcast because it helps us to grow our audience here. It lets other people know what you appreciate about Girlfriends and can encourage us to grow our audience and our listenership here at Girlfriends. Anyway, this is what Becky wrote. She said, "Great host, fascinating guests, brilliant tips for all moms. I love listening to this podcast. Danielle is a really likable host and really does share humbly ways to grow your faith and your families too within a normal family life. Thanks to Danielle and your guests." Thank you so much for taking the time to leave that review, Becky. If you want to leave a review, just click on over to wherever you're listening to this podcast right now. If you're listening on YouTube, just make sure you're subscribed here and leave us a comment. And you can give us a thumbs up. You can like and rate us in that way. Or if you listen on Spotify or anywhere else, we'd love to have your review that way. Or if you just listen on the website, I know some people do that. Good old fashioned kind of click play over at the website over at goodcatholic.com or on social media, wherever you like to listen. Maybe you want to share the link with somebody. Help us to spread the word about Girlfriends because this community is truly enriched by your participation in it. It's truly enriched by the variety of the people who are participating in the audience, the people sending in questions, the people giving me feedback, the people who are suggesting topics that we take up on future shows. All of that really helps me to form this podcast because ultimately, I'm here for you. I want this podcast to serve you and your needs. I want this podcast to be encouraging to you in your vocation as a Catholic woman. The best way I can do that is if I hear from you. So thank you, Becky, and thank you to all who've left ratings and reviews, and thank you for considering doing the same. All right, that's all the time we have for today, but thank you so much for being here. I don't take for granted that you have a lot of things going on in your life, and so the fact that you take time to share here with me on Girlfriends each week truly means the world to me. I'm so encouraged by that, and I am grateful for your presence here. And until next time, I hope you enjoy your day, and God bless your week.